Evals actually force you to get into the shoes of your user. Like you can no longer just hypothesize, I wonder if they'll do this, or I wonder if they'll do that. Like it kind of forces the PM to be way more empathetic of the customer and what the customer is going to try to do and articulate that in writing, which is a whole nother skill. So you want to translate your understanding of the user into text, and then you want to kind of use that to iterate on the system. I think that's hard. I also think that, there's a high level of subjectivity and non-determinism, which makes it challenging. Like it's not as easy to predict as writing code, like what the outcomes are going to be in this case. And you're trying to model human behavior as much as possible. Let's say the LLM writes a sentence or the AI writes a sentence. Like, was that a good sentence? It depends a lot on the context. It can depend a lot on the different scenarios that you're putting the system into. And so understanding and looking at the data and basically seeing, okay, here's the clusters of types of scenarios that the system is going to be put into, and being able to break the system up into more components and more fine-grained scenarios makes the writing of the evals easier, because now you're iterating in a tighter loop, but it is really hard to think about this when you're first getting started.
All right, welcome everyone. My guest today is Aman Khan, Director of Product at Arize AI. So Aman and I attended a talk recently, Chief Product Officers of OpenAI and Anthropic, who both agreed that writing AI evaluations will be the most important skill for product teams moving forward. So I'm really excited to dig in with Aman today on the key skills that AI PMs need, including learning how to get better at writing evaluations. So welcome, Aman.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Peter. And yeah, that was a pretty crazy moment to be sitting in the audience there. And then I remember we both left the talk and started talking about evals. And yeah, really glad we get to do this.
Yeah. So maybe you could start by introducing yourself and how you became an AI PM at a company that specializes in writing evals.
Yeah, for sure. So funnily enough, I've actually been kind of working on the same problem for most of my career. So I actually started by working on evals for self-driving. So I actually started as an engineer at a company working in the self-driving space, and then kind of realized that it's really messy trying to figure out what exactly do we need to do to make the car better or worse. And this is super applicable now, even in the LLM and generative world, where you're trying to work with these black boxes, but you're not really sure, am I making this thing better? How do I measure the performance of the system? And I kind of just kept that through line by, realizing there's actually a lot of products to be built in the space, a lot of, really messy dashboards or getting the right metrics and the right data in place. And so that actually allowed me to leap to going to Spotify to work on the machine learning platform. And while I was there, I was sort of still working on the same sort of data problem. How do we use data in machine learning in the models that we're shipping in production? And then it was actually there that I actually discovered the company I'm at now called Arize. And Spotify is actually a customer of Arize, which sort of worked out in a funny way there. But I sort of just kept that through line going of trying to make it easier for people, engineers, product people that are building with AI systems, understand the impact of their models. And I think this is going to be a pretty long tail problem. So a lot of really interesting product challenges along the way to solve.
Yeah, because these models are like a black box. You can't really tell what's going on. But everyone keeps talking about AI PM. It's kind of become a meme, this AI PM thing. And everyone wants to become an AI PM these days. So if you had to list a couple of key skills that you can build right now to become an AI PM, what would it be?
Yeah, so it might even be helpful just to sort of recap for folks that, if this term is new, just in case, just to set the right terminologies and define correctly. But I kind of view AI PMs as people that are building products with or around AI. And that means, it sounds silly to say now, I think that AI feels very new. It's everyone's trying to catch up. But, ultimately, I do think long term, all PMs are going to be some flavor of AI PM. Either you're building on top of some sort of LLM API, doing something or some model in the back end, performing some action in your product, or you're going to be using these tools in your day to day, to solve problems. And so I think it's helpful to sort of frame this as really AI starts to become a core part of the skill stack for PMs in the first place. And then once you kind of start from there, I think there's maybe, kind of a few sort of high level ways to think about how to build your own knowledge in the space. I sort of look at maybe 5 different areas here. So I would kind of view this as, start with the fundamentals. What are the high level areas of AI and ML that, you would, really are being used today in the industry to actually deploy these models in the first place? And think about this in the context of what would you want to apply in your products or in the problems that you're trying to solve for your customers. There's a couple helpful resources. I sort of plugged the Andrej Karpathy one in the last podcast I did with Lenny, but I think another really helpful resource I've kind of been referencing myself and came across is there's a really nice algorithm map that Marilee, who's an AI product manager as well at Google, has put together, where she actually goes through, here's when you would use this algo for this thing. And this is what machine learning is useful for. I'll give you an example. Things like, understanding, okay, what do I do to predict a user's actions? Should I use a regression model, a classification model? It helps you frame the decisions that you want to make in the form of statistics and models. And I think that's just a helpful framing to have. So basically the goal here is understand what these things are good at and what they're not good at. And that's really the core intuition that you're trying to build. Ironically, I'll pause there in case there's any thought.
No, I think that's a really good point, because it's important to realize that there's actually different types of models, like you said, that solve different problems.
Yeah.
Like a model that solves like discovery is very different from like a LLM model, right? So
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, you can't just it's like showing up to a hardware store and you're like, I need a tool. And the people are going to be like, what tool do you need? And you're like, you can't just use a hammer for everything, right? Like there's that expression that goes like, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. It's sort of the same thing with AI. Like if you're using LLMs for everything, you're probably going to have a bad time. These things aren't necessarily great at everything. You might need a different algo. You might need a different approach. They're very good at generalizing, but it's helpful to understand how to think about the space more broadly. So I do think that fundamental starting point is really important. And you might actually find as you're going through this journey that certain algorithms or certain spaces of machine learning or AI are maybe more interesting to you and more interesting for you to go down that deep rabbit hole. It's very likely that, people are already talking about an industry that we're sort of hitting a plateau with what LLMs can do. And so ultimately, we're going to need to combine different algorithms to actually get the results that we want. And we actually see that ourselves as well with customers that we work with. It's not just an LLM going and doing something. It's usually like combined with a ranking model to give you a result or a classification model. So that's the foundation. I'll kind of go through a couple more areas, which I actually think are core product skills in the first place. Customer obsession and curiosity are really the two things that are going to drive you kind of coming back to, okay, now that you have the foundation, you have at least the basis. You're not going to have a master's or PhD in the subject, but at least okay, this is what this thing is good at. This is what this other thing is good at. Now you kind of let your curiosity drive you to the next stage, which is, what are the problems I'm trying to solve for my customers? What's the thing that's most important to solve for them? And then allow you to really take that curiosity and keep trying to prototype and basically try and solve the problem for yourself. And there's sort of this thought where, I think that prototyping is going to be a pretty core skill. I think that curiosity is going to pivot into prototyping, and just being able to try the tools yourselves. You'll learn from, the AI experiences in the first place, what is useful in your day to day and what's a terrible tool in the first place. So you're kind of prototyping, developing that intuition. And then I do think last but not least, okay, you've got the foundation. You've got the knowledge. You have the understanding for what to go and solve for your customers. And you know how to build prototypes. You're not done there. You actually do still need to understand how well your system is performing overall. And that's really where evals and observability come in. And I do think that's going to be maybe one of the most important skills for PMs to be able to learn is you can't just ship with AI. You have to be able to measure what your system is.
Got it. So can you just quickly recap the key skills again? It's
I kind of, if I had to boil it all down, I would say the fundamentals, customer obsession, curiosity to learn and prototype, learning from great AI experiences, and then evals kind of make up this 5 pillars of what you'll need to do or need to learn as an AI PM yourself. And if I were to put it into one sentence, I would say build knowledge, experience, and best practices on shipping high quality AI products in the real world, and then be able to measure the impact.
Got it. I actually think the curiosity part is actually pretty important. I think a lot of big company PMs actually don't have that curiosity, or they're too busy just writing slide decks and making docs. And it's not time to actually play around with stuff themselves.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's that's sort of the realization in myself as well. Like, I imagine you could just show up to the meeting with a prototype instead of PRD. I think that's the shift that PMs are going to have to undergo as they figure out how to communicate better in this new world.
And also, I think it's important to emphasize, I think that you don't have to add this, you don't even have to have PM as a job title to start working on the skills, because like AI has made it's actually arguably easier to ship stuff with AI yourself than to try to get buying out a company and try to ship something.
Yeah.
So,
I think that there's like it's funny, like I'm sure I've seen that you've like made fun of this stuff in the past, but like there's always that like trope of like the PM is the CEO of the product, like that's what people say, oh, the CEO of the product. But like, I actually think that has never been true until now, because now you actually have these like superpowers that you as a CEO of a product can actually go and be like, let me go write some marketing copy and test it out. Let me go build a quick version of the website. I don't have to wait for the engineering team to do this. Like you can just go and start getting things done. And that can really be motivational for the team. And I highly encourage that's like where you'll learn, oh, okay, I actually, this is where I need help. This is where we need to iterate. So actually you can be the CEO of the product now. I think before was like, people were just saying that to feel better about themselves.
Yeah. And like, when people think AI tools, AI products, a lot of people just go naturally towards the chatbot, right? Like just make another chatbot. But like, I think a lot of the really good AI products are actually not very sexy. They're more focused on like fixing tiny little friction points in the core workflow. So I'm curious, like outside of like, ChatGPT and like, Claude and stuff, what are some of your favorite AI tools in the market around this?
I think lately I've been pretty obsessed with the prototyping tools out there and like coding agents. We can plug like a Twitter thread where I actually break down. There's a lot of them out there, so it's a little bit overwhelming. I spent a weekend just trying a bunch and then like dumping my own thoughts. And I've just been using those a ton for prototyping. I'll give you an example. So we were sitting in a meeting and we were like, darn, we really need to like ship this usage dashboard for a customer so that they can see, across their enterprise, how many people are using the product. And we're going to need to put like an engineer on this for like 3 weeks or 3 days or a week to like go and figure out, okay, here's how we pull the data in the right place and then like build a nice UI. And then like while we're debating all of that, I literally just went to Replit, and Replit just lets you type in a prompt. It's not really a chatbot because it's not going to give you a bunch of text. It's actually going to go and write code for you to actually build a real functional prototype. And I literally just did that in the meeting. I copy pasted the Pendo docs, which is a tool that we use. And I basically told it, okay, build a usage dashboard for this customer. Here's an API key. And in the end of the meeting, we had like something we could look at and be like, oh, wow, we just did that while we were talking about it. So I think that bias to action is going to help a ton, but I'm obsessed pretty lately with the coding agents. Another example is maybe like 2 more examples here, actually. One is that, I needed, a quick refresh of my personal website. And I still remember the first time I coded my personal website, after HTML, then I wanted to like do something a bit more like React Native. I took like a week in college to go like at the end of my nights and weekends, like I'd go and write, oh, this is, like my personal portfolio, whatever. And then you have like the Wix templates, but you don't really like those. You want it to be a bit more personal. And now with Vercel, there's a tool called V0, which builds really beautiful front ends. And so, it does more than that as well. It's pretty capable product, but personally I like the look and feel of that. And you can just like drop images in and get, pretty functional prototype result at the other end of it. So I use that to build my personal website. And then I think last but not least, I've been playing around a lot with like Claude writing styles. So, you can actually give a sample of your writing now, and Claude will try and build actually sort of mimic the way that you write based on that. And it's pretty good. It's not fully there yet, but it is the cold start problem there a little.
Yeah, that's what I've been doing with Claude, just like giving it a ton of my really good writing and like, being lazy and asking it to edit stuff for me.
Yeah.
It works out well. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the skill just starts to become, how do you get the right product out of that? How do you prompt it the right way to actually get the result that you want?
Yeah, the prototyping thing is interesting. Like I also try to play around with some of the stuff. I feel like it's pretty good for making like little toy apps and like proof of concepts for yourself. And maybe a personal website too, but like it hasn't got to a point where you can actually like make a SaaS product and sell it all online. Well, but I feel like it's pretty close. I don't know. I feel like even like a year from now, it could happen.
Yeah. I think that's totally true. Like what's funny is that like if you go on YouTube, there's like so many videos. All you have to do, like a little hack, if like to anyone listening to this and like wants to try this out themselves, but they're like, you know, maybe they're sitting on their sofa, they don't want to like go reach for their laptop. Just go to YouTube and like type in, you know, cursor or V0, and you'll see a ton of tutorials where people will like build a SaaS app in like 10 minutes. A lot of people are claiming to be able to go and like build entire companies on top of that. I don't know how feasible that is necessarily, but it is really interesting to see, you know, that's where the space is headed for sure.
Got it. Yeah. I'm not sure. I believe people who claim that they're making a lot of money from this stuff, but we'll see. Yeah. But just to wrap up this chat, like I feel like what I really love about these AI tools is that, like, dude, there's so much time wasted by PMs to like even try to get a job as PM. You have to go as case interviews that are kind of like hypothetical, and then you got to do like in your PM job, you're writing all these docs, you do go through all these reviews, and none of the shit actually about the real product that you're trying to build, right?
Yeah.
So like I hope with this AI tools, like we actually shift the attention back to the actual product you're trying to deliver to customers. You know, that is my dream.
I think we're getting there closer. And you were at the same conference, and there's this talk from like Clairvaux where, you know, there's like Venn diagrams of like functional areas and jobs. And like, I actually do believe in the thesis that like jobs and roles are going to be less important, and actually skills and how you use tools to your advantage are going to be more important. So that's like an example where, you know, you're not just going to be writing docs. I think pretty soon, I think it'll be a lot more about like actually solving the end user's problems even more. So
yeah, that hopefully will make the PM job a lot more fun. Yeah. But let's talk about eval. Let's talk about like the most important skill, man, for PMs. So well, what exactly is an eval, and why is it so important?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to frame this a little bit as well, like in the context of a product. And I'll make it really simple. This is my mental model that I kind of use to think about building products in the first place. I think if you really boil it down, a product's imagine like a diagram. A product is a box in the middle, and you have an input and an output. And the input could be things like, you know, a customer coming and trying to solve a problem, and the output is the solution. Like the product is trying to solve that, you know, in some way. It could be like, let's make it tactical. Let's say I'm going to a website and I want to, you know, have like, basically have this experience where I type in, I'm going to, you know, San Francisco, and help me book a trip to do that. You know, help me book everything in the middle. And the outcome is you actually get your trip booked. Now, there's a lot of steps in the middle. Like we were oversimplifying this, but at the end of the day, what you care about is that the user has a good experience. And evals are the way that you measure how good or bad the box in the middle, the product is. And I think before in like software, 2.0, whatever software 1.0, 2.0 like days, you could kind of view like, okay, are we calling the right API? Are we, is the code being constructed correctly? Like this is a very deterministic system. And now the entire system is a lot less deterministic because of large language models. These are statistical systems now. So there's a certain degree of like variability, and there's work being done to make the systems more reliable and just reason better and think more, OpenAI released this just yesterday. They have a much more reliable model called O1 Pro, but it's much slower. And so, really what you need are tools that measure the goodness of the system. And those can come in a few different flavors that we can get into in terms of like code feedback and, using other LLMs to actually measure the performance of the system as a whole. So that's a high level of like evals. Evals are how you measure the goodness of the system. And that's really consists of your data, your eval method, and, basically the metric you want to use to actually analyze the system as a whole.
How good is the output given the input, right? Like how good is the black box at making the output given some user input?
Exactly. How good is it at solving, how good is your product at solving this problem qualitatively and quantitatively?
Yeah. I think the difference is like, in the good old days, the user only had like one type of input, like click a button and then it does this. But now the user has like thousands of different types of inputs.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's like, these systems are becoming like multimodal. There's voice. Did they hear you correctly? Like, and even then I would actually even argue like, in the product, PM days of like, oh, is the user clicking this button? Like now you can get much deeper and understand like, why are they, doing something or not? You can get a lot more, the data becomes much richer to use for debugging with LLMs.
Yeah, that's a really good point because the user is actually maybe telling the problem through chat or something as opposed to clicking a button. Yeah, that's a good point.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Can you talk about briefly, like where do evals fit in the process of building a AI product?
Yeah. I was kind of giving this analogy to someone like, imagine that you're like going to study to become a doctor. Like you want to be, you want to go be a doctor. Like imagine that's the product that you're trying to build is like some sort of like doctor or something like this. The eval is basically the test that you're giving the doctor before the doctor is actually starting to see patients in the first place. There's a ton of reviews. You want to make sure that the system like understands what it's getting into. Like, there's like technical things, scientific things you're trying to like solve for to make sure that the system is actually good enough in the first place before it starts getting into production. And an eval sits at that earliest step. It's like, think of it as like the medical text or the test that you're giving the system. And you want that to be representative of the real world. Like it doesn't make sense to like test doctors on like theoretical things that they're not ever going to apply. So you really want the eval to be sort of at the earliest stage of development, what you're using to guide the system as a whole. So once you've identified a problem and you figured out, okay, here's what the inputs look like, here's what it should do, and here's the output that we're going for, the eval helps you measure at the earliest stages of development, are we actually building the right system? So that's really where evals start.
Okay. So is it kind of like analogous to like running an A/B test or something? Like, or maybe I guess A/B tests can be part of evals? Yeah.
Yeah, I think like, it almost feels like evals are like a new kind of A/B test. Like before you would have to, split your audience and like get into production and see like, what are certain people doing, and are they like, what do they like this color or that color better? Like evals are sort of the way that you do that with LLM based systems. And evals sort of tell you, there's this new flavor of A/B tests in a way. It's a good way to put it.
Okay. So let's talk about how the sausage is made a little bit, right? So like, well, first of all, I'm not an expert on writing evals, but you are. But when I write evals, I usually start the manual process, right? So like you have like, what are 5 of the most common questions the user will be asking? And then you try to write like, okay, here's like the 5 ideal answers. And then it just feels like, it honestly feels more painful than like trying to write a TRD because you actually have to put yourself in the user's shoes and think about what the answer. But like, why is it so hard, man? Like, why is this, or is there ways to make it easier?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that you bring up a really good point, which is evals actually force you to get into the shoes of your user. Like you can no longer just hypothesize, I wonder if they'll do this, or I wonder if they'll do that. Like it kind of forces the PM to be way more empathetic of the customer and what the customer is going to try to do and articulate that in writing, which is a whole nother skill. So you want to translate your understanding of the user into text, and then you want to kind of use that to iterate on the system. I think that's hard. I also think that, there's a high level of subjectivity and non-determinism, which makes it challenging. Like it's not as easy to predict as writing code, like what the outcomes are going to be in this case. And you're trying to model human behavior as much as possible. And so when the system is subjective, that can be really tough. I can give an example from like the self-driving space, actually, that's very, analogous to here, which is when we were trying to solve evals for a self-driving car, we had a bunch of, we basically have like humans sitting and saying like, okay, did the car make this left turn correctly? Was it a good left turn to make? Was it smooth? Did the car commit at the right time? Was it too fast? Whatever it might be. And it turns out that's actually pretty subjective. Like, someone's, good left turn is different. Like some people would be like, no, I would never have done that left turn. And then when you start adding in more variables, like imagine someone is like crossing at the same time on the sidewalk and the car makes a left turn. Should it have done that? It can get really specific and nuanced. And, I think that's actually really relatable to the LLM world now, because it's hard to say, like, let's say the LLM writes a sentence or the AI writes a sentence. Like, was that a good sentence? It depends a lot on the context. It can depend a lot on the different scenarios that you're putting the system into. And so understanding and looking at the data and basically seeing, okay, here's the clusters of types of scenarios that the system is going to be put into, and being able to break the system up into more components and more fine-grained scenarios makes the writing of the evals easier, because now you're iterating in a tighter loop. But it is really hard to think about this when you're first getting started, for sure.
Got it. Yeah, you gotta like think about all the edge cases, think about where it could go wrong. Yeah. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's make this more practical. Let's take like a real example of an AI product. So like, I think a pretty common AI product is like a customer support AI agent, right? Like it helps you answer any customer support and answers. And how would you use different types of evals to make this thing better? Yeah.
Yeah. So like the sort of customer support, like classic, like, I'm trying to get a refund or something like this, like that type of like customer support agent.
Yeah. Like for like a retail or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For retail. Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways that you kind of want to think about the system. A lot of it comes down to the data itself. So how do you, maybe to like reframe your question, your thought is like, what are the ways that I can measure my system as a whole, right? Like, how do I know if this retail agent is actually like solving the customer's problem? So an example is like, I want to return, this laptop or something like that. Well, let's think about the system a little bit more deeply. You actually have a few things you can measure. So let's imagine it is a chat box, just to simplify the system even more, just to get started. And you can say, okay, well, there's one user that's typing in, I want to return my laptop, right? And then the agent can like perform some actions, maybe reason about, okay, like, are you within the return window? Is the laptop undamaged? Are you able to actually return this thing? And those are all sort of rules. Those are like, those are things that the agent can kind of, the customer support agent can have like coded into it. And so that's pretty straightforward in the sense that you can check, okay, you have some inputs from the user and you're transforming those into the rule-based system that the agent needs to follow. So that's kind of like the high level where you have real user data and you have the LLM's outputs and you can kind of compare where there's actually some ground truth. For instance, I can say, no, I'm not within the return window. If the agent says, okay, well, let's continue to process your return. Like that's an example where the agent has gone off the rails. It's hallucinating. And you can test that by actually having another human grade the responses and say, this is an example where the agent was incorrect. So that's your immediate starting point, is just getting the right data in place, the input from the user and the human label. I think you can also use some pretty straightforward, simple classifications or guardrails. Like if I start swearing in the chat, like that's a string match. That doesn't need to be a super sophisticated system, but you can also say, okay, is this, customer being rude? Do you want to be able to detect that? Are they trying to jailbreak my system or try to get it to say something it shouldn't do, which happens sometimes. That's made in the news. So that's another example of where you would want to be able to check the system is not being manipulated. So that's like a high level where you really want to start getting started with the data. And then when you actually, have like those first 5 or 10 examples, you can use that to actually generate even more data for testing. So you could try to simulate more scenarios where the LLM might be incorrect and try to make sure that your system is robust against those different scenarios. And then last but not least, you want to actually test this. So you go out and you test with beta users and you do the A/B tests like you were saying. And you might be testing different prompts against each other too, or different tools or different parts of the system that you are editing. And you want to compare that to the original sort of examples you were using in experiments and see, okay, how far off are our experiments from the real world? Do we need to make our experiments better? And so this actually starts to look more like an iterative loop where you start with the data, you kind of build on top of that in with different metrics, you get more and more data, and then eventually you use the real world to actually improve the system as a whole.
Okay, so just so I understand it. So step 1 is you have a bunch of, like maybe you upload your return policy to the AI and then you have a bunch of past real human agent conversations with customer support agents, right? So maybe that's the data that you start with, and then maybe you write a few ground truth answers, like for different stuff. Okay, and then there's like easy ways to filter out sort words or like things that are completely not related to the customer support. So that's step 1. And then you actually get some other LLM, that you get some other to generate synthetic data set based on your human data set. And maybe like get one LLM to evaluate another LLM, right?
Exactly.
Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So you're kind of building this, to double click on that, you're using the initial human labels as the way for you to seed, is this, how do you augment or automate that part of the job with an LLM so that you don't need to have a human labeling every single, response once you actually ship the product. You can have another system sitting on top and doing that.
Okay. And then we get to a point where like, okay, this is actually good enough to test with real users So then you run an A/B test, or maybe you run an A/B test with maybe 5% goes to this AI thing, and 5% still go to the real human agents. And then you compare some sort of metric, or what are some metrics for the saying that you would look at, accuracy or?
Yeah. So I think it depends very highly on the system that you're trying to build. So you give a good example of customer support agent. You do want to check accurate, the rules, is the LLM following the rules? That's accuracy. That's a pretty simple comparison. You can also do, if the LLM has to give more open-ended responses and you want it to, and the tone of your company, you want it to be maybe extra professional. If it's a legal company, maybe you want it to sound more casual and fun if it's a travel company. So you can do things like matching the tone. Is the LLM starting to get frustrated if the user is getting frustrated? You don't want that to happen, right? So that's an example where you actually want to validate depending on the use case and pick the right metrics. But at the baseline, you're looking at correctness. You're looking at hallucination, which is the LLM, responding correctly when it has the context. And then what is the overall tone and sentiment? Those are maybe a few starting points that are pretty common that we see, but it gets a lot more specific depending on the agents. For instance, if you're, going back to the tool example, is the LLM using a hammer when it should be using a screwdriver, just as an example for a different API? You want to make sure it's using the right tools as well to solve the problem. But it depends a lot on the use case. And generally it's you're using human labels to validate as you go through.
So but how do you evaluate something like tone? Do you randomly sample some of the AI's answers and see get a human labeler to evaluate tone? Or
yeah, I think that's and what you're hitting at is in the whole point is humans are still in the loop when it comes to the initial evaluation.
Yeah.
Because someone needs to ensure that you're still solving problems for real humans on the other end. And even if there's an agent on the other end, you're the one that's determining, okay, is my product actually solving the problem? So you do need a human to, let's go back to the simple input output. Humans need to look at the inputs and the outputs before you can start handing that off to another LLM to do that for you.
That makes sense. And go a little deeper. Let's say this customer support agent, I have a fancy prompt that I use, but I also have a retrieval system. I'm retrieving different parts of my return policy or documentation based on the questions that the user asks. So if something goes wrong, how do I know? Should I update my prompt? Should I update my retrieval? How do I know what to fix?
Man, Peter, you're always asking hard questions here. Yeah, we're good. So I joke because I really do think that actually your questions is a good example of, how to actually determine if the system is performing well. You want to break up the problem into smaller problems and components. Think of this as you're building a Lego structure or something like that. The Lego structure consists of blocks, consists of maybe different components. It's not going to be one big Lego block, right? So you kind of want to break down your system as much as possible to evaluate each component in its own sort of iterative loop. And that actually is a principle that also gets borrowed from software engineering, right? You have your unit tests at the individual granular levels, and that's very applicable to the AI evals that you write. You want to be testing for hallucinations using the context that you have, as well as correctness, as well as tone. And then you want to keep going deeper and deeper. So, let's use an example. Your question was how do I know if I need to tweak my prompt or change my retrieval or change my model? You actually should be able to iterate across all of those things and see which one is having the biggest impact. And so now what actually comes back to your initial point, I can't tell you, okay, you need to tweak the prompt, you need to tweak the retrieval, you need to tweak the model. You actually just need a tool that helps you do that really well, because those are all parameters that you can update. And so picking the right tool to help you iterate with all of those different parameters is going to be, kind of actually the problem you want to solve. It's the diagnosis on your overall system.
Okay, because you don't really know until you actually make the change, right? IT.
Yeah, exactly.
It's for the speed of the iteration loops. Yeah,
exactly. We've seen, systems where we thought, man, this is going to be so much harder to solve. An example, we have our own Copilot in the platform that actually helps users debug their AI. And that's actually kind of unique. We're actually building AI to help you debug AI. And all the time we'll like hit a scenario where like, man, this one use case keeps coming up, like this customer keeps getting stuck or the agent's not very good at this one thing. And then we'll like add one line to the prompt and it will like completely solve the problem, right? It doesn't happen every time, but you never know. So you just have to be able to iterate very quickly on different ways to solve the problem.
Got it. Yeah, so the waterfall product development process is dead, man. Like, I can't just write a PRD and just like, hand it over to the designer and engineer, but hey, go do this. It doesn't work anymore.
It could be fun to like riff on that in a whole different setting of like waterfall is dead. What does it look like? And, what does like product management look like now with AI? Like, what's the right term to use? Actually, I have no idea what the right analogy is there.
I mean, you just got like iterate every hour, man. Like every few hours. Yeah, but no.
Clock cycle, maybe it's like the way to look at it, like clock cycles for a GPU or something like that.
Yeah. So we started this conversation by talking about like, you don't have to have all those credentials, right? You don't need to have like a PhD, ML or something to get better at writing evals now, right? So how, let's say I'm laying a piano, I'm just a random person with a laptop. How do I practice getting better at writing evals?
Yeah. So let's go a level deeper. So we've been talking about evals in the context of like, this is how you measure your system. It can be code. It can be an LLM, evaluating your system overall. But I want to get like one level deeper on that, which is the eval is really in many ways, if it's an LLM, evaluating your system, it's just another prompt, right? Like the example would be, you are a LLM, you're an agent that is, the best customer support agent in the world. Like this is the eval prompt that you're writing. And your job is to check the work of this other agent. And all of a sudden you've created like a judge LLM, right? And you say, here is the context. Here is the right, here's what the agent responded with. Was the agent correct or not correct? And so I think when you look at that system as a whole, it's really just prompts. It's just text. And so in the same way that you have to build that first early initial version, like I think that the PM actually has this opportunity to put themselves in the shoes of what do you want the customer experience to look and feel like? And the way that you want to think about that is like, okay, well, we all know that if you type in something into Claude or ChatGPT and you say, and I gave you the prompt I just have, like, was this correct or incorrect? You're going to get this like long response on the other end, right? But it'll be like, oh, the agent was incorrect because, used the context here, but it didn't reference that. Like, that's not actually something that you can use and to improve the system. It's just going to be like another essay. So the way that you get evals to actually be usable, or you think about like the outputs in the form of labels. And so you really want it to say like at the end, only answer with 2 words, correct or incorrect. And you actually probably want some enforcement or some system that checks, okay, let me pull out the correct or incorrect. And we actually have an open source tool that does just that. It's just like 2 lines of code and you can reference them off the shelf prompts that we have or write your own. And you just provide what we call rails, which is only correct or incorrect so that you don't get the essay out on the other end. So that's one example, very common problem that comes up. You also want the evals to be fast. And so like picking the right models and multi-threading is also pretty important when you're writing evals because you don't want to be sitting there waiting for like 100 rows to be, one by one, go to ChatGPT and come back out. Like you want the APIs to feel fast, responsive. And then I think the other point is like using the right prompts. You have a great prompting guide. I think like having the right prompting in place and iterating with your prompt is, you'd be surprised. Certain methods that you might use can have a huge impact. The most classic example of that is actually providing examples in the prompt. So when I go back to the agent that is checking the other agent, like you are a customer support agent checking this other, agent, like make sure that it's answering correctly. Here's an example of a correct answer. Here's an example of an incorrect answer. If you just put that in your prompt, I guarantee you that will also improve the results of your system as a whole. But there's a lot of other sort of tweaks you can do along the way. And then that kind of gets you to your first level of writing a good eval that you can then top up. Last kind of like tip I'll say is like, don't try to optimize too soon. Like try to optimize for the best result versus, trying to save money or cost on the model in the first place.
Got it. I have to think so I have this prompt that I use to turn these conversations into written interviews just as a user, right? Like for Claude. And, sometimes it does the edit, and then it's not really that good. Like I have to go manually clean it up. And then sometimes I will like paste back in the manual edit that I did and be like, hey, what's the difference between your edit and my edit? And then it's just like, here's all the differences. Yeah. And then I'm like, okay, so then can you update this prompt to make it get to my edit in one shot, So that is like a pretty dumb version of eval, right? That's basically what I'm doing. I'm trying to do it.
Totally. I think that's a really smart version of eval because it's like you're using your data. You like, let's just use the exact same example you just gave of like with an entire LLM system. Like you are basically building a system using LLMs and AI and you're iterating on it with evals. Like you're saying, here's my data. This is what you wrote. This is what I preferred. Now use that to actually go and update the prompt in the first place. And so you're actually building a system that's learning from itself. And you in this case, Peter, are the eval, which is like good or bad, right? And then you're providing that back. Eventually, you could probably build an agent that was Peter checking his own work on the written output and saying, how would you improve on this? Pull out the interesting insights that Peter would want and then feed that back into the first prompt. Now you have a multi-agent system. And then there's ways that you kind of are building kind of this like mini company in itself. That's how I kind of view it as like, you are the CEO of the product. So you're kind of like orchestrating these agents as employees in a way.
Yeah. I need like a senior agent to manage the intern agent.
A little group PM agent. Yeah.
Yeah. But the thing like doing the stuff with Claude is like very manual, right? So like, let's talk about Arize. That's like, how can Arize help people with evals?
Yeah. So we actually are Arize. We actually build systems that help you build AI in the first place. The way we do that is kind of like at 3 levels. So we have a ton of free education, free courses, sort of work like handbooks that help you get started. You can go straight to our website to, download those immediately. And that's actually like a helpful resource if you kind of got some takeaways from this, episode, but also wanted to go deeper on a few of the subjects we talk about. So I highly recommend checking that out. The second level is open source tooling. So we mentioned evals, but like, you're not going to want to sit there and like write your whole system to run evals. Like it just doesn't make sense for, engineers to go and like rebuild what's already out there. So we actually have open source tools that help PMs and engineers that are getting started write evals and also trace and monitor their products in the first place. So we actually help you do that, like breaking down of your system using traces, which actually is like the Lego block analogy, and then evals to help you actually evaluate the system as a whole. All of that is open source and free to use. You can host it yourself. You don't need security permissions. It's honestly just trying to get more people to like look at their system, look at their data. So we're going to keep putting out more and more there to make it free. And then I'd say like last but not least, we do have an enterprise product that helps, more mature products and teams that need like security support and scale. And so yeah, it's also free to try. There's no gate on the product. And if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear it. So yeah, we're really trying to get more people to look at their data and build better AI systems. Because let's be honest, we need more and better AI systems. We need more different perspectives and different PMs thinking about how to use these tools. So that's my goal.
That's awesome that you have. I didn't realize you had all these open source tools. Like, where can people find the open source tools?
Yeah. So the open source tool is called Phoenix. So it's Phoenix Arises. So it's like phoenix.arize.com.
That's great.
Yeah. And there's like a GitHub repo. Again, you don't even have to talk to anyone. We also have a Slack community where if you have any questions, you like can actually join it, and you'll have, it's funny, like the first line of defense in questions will be like actually a pretty good AI agent. And then you'll actually have like, more discussion or humans on top of that too. So it's a good place to learn, get resources, and like, basically learn from others as well.
Awesome. Any closing words of advice for folks watching this podcast? Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing that keeps coming back to me is like, I get this like general sense that in Silicon Valley that people feel like, man, the AI revolution is here. And like, how do I like pivot my job? How do I get that title AI PM? Like so many people on LinkedIn are like updating their resumes and like trying to like catch up. They feel like they're catching up. And my sort of note here is I honestly think it's a lot like surfing, which if you've like surfed before, you know that things kind of come in waves, and you actually have to like predict or see what wave is coming and time that, and the goal is actually to be on like so much of surfing actually comes down to just being in the right place on this wave before it comes. And my note is like the wave is actually pretty early still. Like there's a lot of room for different perspectives and approaches. And I think bringing your own unique approach to building with AI is really what the ecosystem needs right now. We just need more people being in the right spot so that when the wave really starts to pump, like you have more people riding it. So that's how I view it. Like you're not late. In fact, you're probably still pretty early. And the goal is really just to get to the right spot on the wave.
Yeah. And, I want to emphasize that, getting to the right spot is not like taking like 5 AI courses or something, or like trying to get a playbook on like how to do this AI PM thing, right? It's just like actually trying to stuff out yourself.
Try it out yourself. Join the right community, I think is like another tip there as well. Try it out yourself, join the right communities, be around people that are trying these tools out and building AI products so that you can learn from them and they can learn from you. And then I think that's really what I'm trying to leave people with.
Awesome. Where can people find you online, Aman, if they have more questions?
Yeah. If you want to reach out to me, website is amank.ai, new domain there. And then you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or X as well. I might be slow to respond. If I don't respond, just hit me again with another message. Promise I'll try to get back to you. But yeah, really trying to help more people build with AI.
Awesome. Awesome, man. This is an awesome conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I learned a lot.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Yeah.